They invited her to laugh at her, but the moment she walked through those ballroom doors, every smile disappeared. The ex-husband who divorced her, the sister who stole him, and every guest expecting a broken woman froze in disbelief. Beside her stood Korea's most powerful billionaire, while 3 breathtaking children held her hands. Then one little girl looked at the groom and whispered, "Mom, is that the man who abandoned us?" The room fell silent. What happened next didn't just ruin a wedding. It exposed a betrayal hidden for 8 years and left the bride, groom, and every guest speechless forever. The rain had not started yet when Simone Carter walked into the house that afternoon, holding a small envelope against her chest like it was made of glass. She had rehearsed the words in the taxi, over and over, until they felt real enough to say out loud. Dr. Yoon had smiled at her that morning, a smile she had not seen on a doctor's face in years, and told her the news that would finally change everything between her and her husband. She was 30 years old now, though on that day she was only 22, newly married, still learning the sound of her own name in a house that never felt fully hers. Simone had grown up in Seoul from the time she could walk, the daughter of a woman who cleaned houses for diplomats, and Korean was the only language her mouth remembered easily. Her skin was dark, her accent was local, and people who met her for the first time always paused before they spoke, unsure which question to ask first. Growing up, Simone had learned early that she would always stand slightly apart from everyone around her. Children at school teased her about her hair, her voice, the shape of her name in their mouths, until she taught herself to laugh before they could, to disarm the joke before it landed. Her mother used to tell her that being different was not a flaw to apologize for. It was simply a fact to carry with her head up. Simone tried to believe that. Some days it was easier than others. Malik Reed had been different, or so she believed. He was a contractor from Atlanta, sent to Seoul on a 2-year project that stretched into a marriage neither of them had planned carefully. He liked that she understood both worlds. In the beginning, he called her his bridge, his home away from home, and she had loved him the way young women love men who make them feel chosen. They married quickly, within a year of meeting, in a small ceremony that Simone's mother had cried through, not from sadness, but from the simple relief of watching her daughter find something that looked, at the time, like belonging. RENÉE had stood beside Simone that day as her maid of honor, laughing through the vows, promising in her toast that she would always protect her older sister, no matter what life brought either of them. Simone had believed every word of it. But the years after the wedding had not been kind. Malik wanted children quickly, and when none came, the silence in the house grew teeth. His mother stopped calling. His friends stopped inviting them to dinner. Malik himself changed slowly, the way water changes stone, not in one moment, but in 1,000 small ones. A sigh here, a turned back there, until Simone learned to apologize for something she had no control over. She went to every doctor Malik's family suggested, sat through every test, swallowed every supplement recommended by aunts who barely knew her. Each visit ended the same way. Nothing wrong, no explanation, only time to wait and hope. Malik stopped coming to the appointments after the 2nd year, saying his schedule could not allow it, though Simone suspected the truth was simpler, that he could not bear to sit in another waiting room and watch her hope for something that refused to arrive. RENÉE had been the one constant through those years, or so it seemed. She called often, visited when Malik was traveling for work, sat with Simone through the worst of the disappointment with what looked like real tenderness. Simone leaned on her sister more than she leaned on her own husband, grateful for the one person in her life who never once made her feel broken. She had no way of knowing, during any of those visits, that the comfort RENÉE offered was already being weighed against something else entirely. That morning at the clinic, Dr. Yoon had held her hand and told her she was carrying a child. Simone had cried in the waiting room, right there in front of strangers, because for 2 years she had believed her body had failed her, and now she knew it never had. She thought of Malik's face when she would tell him. She thought maybe now he would look at her again, the way he used to, before the silence became the only language they shared. She climbed the stairs 2 at a time, laughing quietly to herself, already choosing the words. Their bedroom door was open, just slightly, and she could hear voices inside, soft and familiar, in a way that made her steps slow without her deciding to slow them. She pushed the door open, and the envelope slipped from her fingers. Malik was there, and her sister RENÉE was there too, tangled together on the bed that Simone had chosen the sheets for herself. Neither of them heard her at first. The room smelled like her own perfume, the one RENÉE must have borrowed from her drawer without asking, and that small detail was the one that made the moment feel unbearably real. Simone did not scream. She did not throw anything, though her hand found the door frame and gripped it hard enough to whiten her knuckles. Her vision blurred at the edges, the way a camera loses focus, and for a moment she could not tell if the sound she heard was her own heartbeat or something breaking inside the house itself. Malik finally turned and saw her standing there. His mouth opened, already shaping an excuse, already reaching for some story that might explain away what could not be explained. RENÉE pulled the sheet up to her chest, her eyes wide, her lips moving without sound. Simone thought, in that strange, stretched-out moment, of every time RENÉE had sat beside her during those long years, holding her hand, telling her the wait would be worth it someday. She thought of birthdays shared, of childhood beds pushed together during thunderstorms, of a sister who was supposed to be the one safe person in a world that had never made room for someone like Simone easily. All of it collapsed at once, quietly, without a single dramatic sound to mark its passing. Simone looked at both of them for a long moment. Then, slowly, she smiled. It was not a happy smile. It was the smile of a woman closing a door quietly instead of slamming it, because slamming it would have given them the satisfaction of her anger. She turned and walked back down the stairs, picked up the fallen envelope from the floor and placed it gently on the hallway table, where Malik would find it later, where he would understand exactly what he had ruined without her needing to say a single word. She did not sleep that night. She sat by the window of the guest room, listening to Malik's footsteps pace the hallway outside her door, listening to him knock softly and then give up when she did not answer. Somewhere in the house, RENÉE had already left, slipping out through the back door like the coward she had chosen to become. By morning, Malik was waiting for her in the kitchen, a folder in his hands. He did not apologize. He did not explain. He simply slid the folder across the table, divorce papers already drawn up, as though he had been carrying them in his briefcase for weeks, waiting for the right excuse to use them. Simone read every page carefully. Her hands did not shake, though her chest felt hollowed out, scraped clean. She thought of the child growing inside her, a secret Malik did not yet know, and would never learn from her lips. She signed her name at the bottom of each page, calm and steady, and slid the folder back to him without a word. Malik looked almost disappointed that she had not fought him. Perhaps he had wanted the fight, wanted the noise, something to justify what he had done. Instead he got silence, and silence from Simone was somehow worse than anything he could have imagined. By evening, her bags were already packed and left outside the gate. Rain had started to fall, thin and cold, the kind that soaked through fabric slowly instead of all at once. Simone stood under the awning of a closed shop across the street, watching the house that used to be hers, wondering where a person goes when the place she called home has just told her she was never truly welcome there. Her phone was nearly out of battery. She had one number left that felt safe to call, a number she had saved years ago under a single word, friend, though both of them had always known it meant something more than that word could hold. Kang Do-yun answered on the second ring, his voice warm even through the static of a bad connection. He had known Simone since she was 25, when their paths crossed at a charity dinner neither of them had wanted to attend. He was the heir to a shipping company that had grown into something far larger under his own hand. But what people remembered about him was not his money, it was the way he listened, fully, without checking his phone or his watch while she spoke. That first dinner, Simone had been seated beside him purely by accident, a mix-up in the seating chart that neither of them bothered to correct once they realized how easy the conversation between them had become. She had come as Malik's wife, quiet and watchful, used to fading into the background of rooms like that one. Do-yun had asked her questions no one else at the table thought to ask, about her mother, about the streets she grew up walking, about which language she dreamed in. No one had ever asked her that last question before. She told him Korean, mostly, though sometimes English crept in during dreams she could not fully explain. He had not tried to court her that night, or any night after, not while she wore another man's ring, but he found reasons to appear at the same events, small courtesies that never crossed into anything improper, a car sent when the weather turned bad, a book left with the doorman after she mentioned an author she admired. Simone noticed. She never let herself think too hard about what the noticing meant. He had told her once, years ago, half joking and half not, that if her marriage ever crumbled, he would be waiting. She had laughed it off then, embarrassed, telling him not to say such things about another man's wife. He had simply smiled and said he could wait a very long time. Now, hearing her voice break over the phone, hearing rain hitting a rooftop somewhere on her end, he understood that the waiting was over. He was in Tokyo that night, in the middle of a meeting that had taken his team 3 months to arrange. He stood up without an explanation, walked out of the boardroom, and told his assistant to cancel everything for the following week. His business partners would be furious. He did not care. He called his driver first, then his housekeeper, giving instructions in a voice so calm it frightened the people listening on the other end because they had never heard him speak that carefully about anything before. Bring her to the penthouse. Keep her warm. Do not ask her questions tonight. Only tomorrow. Simone rode in the car Do-yoon sent, her wet clothes clinging to her skin, her eyes fixed on the city lights blurring past the window. She had expected to feel relief once she was out of the rain, but instead she felt strangely weightless, as though she had stepped outside her own life and was watching a stranger ride through Seoul in the back of an unfamiliar car. The doorman recognized the car before it even stopped, hurrying forward with an umbrella, though the worst of the rain had passed by the time Simone reached the building. He said nothing about her wet clothes or her red eyes, only guided her to the elevator with quiet respect, the kind of discretion that came from years of working for a man who valued privacy above almost everything else. The penthouse was quiet when she arrived, warm light spilling from every room, a robe already laid out for her on the bed, tea already steeping in the kitchen, though no one else was home. She sat on the edge of the bed for a long time before she allowed herself to cry, and when she finally did, she cried the way a person cries only once or twice in a lifetime, from somewhere far beneath the ordinary reasons for tears. Do-yoon landed near midnight and came straight from the airport, still in his work clothes, his tie loosened, exhaustion written plainly on his face though he tried to hide it. He found Simone asleep on the couch, curled into herself, and he did not wake her. He simply sat in the chair across from her and watched her breathe, grateful in a way he could not fully explain, that she had chosen to call him and no one else. In the morning, over tea she barely touched, Simone finally told him everything, the years of blame for a body that had done nothing wrong. The morning at the clinic, the bedroom door left slightly open, the smile she had given them instead of the scream they deserved. Do-yoon listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening only once, when she described the sheets, the perfume, the small cruelty of it all. When she finished, she told him the last piece, the part she had been most afraid to say. She was pregnant. Malik did not know. She did not intend for him to ever know. Do-yoon was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked her only one question, gently, without any weight of expectation behind it. Did she want to keep the baby? Yes, she told him, more than anything. Then that is what we will do, he said simply, as though the matter had never been in doubt, as though there was no version of the future where he was not standing beside her for whatever came next. He did not ask for her love in return. He did not ask her to move faster than her heart could carry her. He simply told her she could stay as long as she needed, that his home had more empty rooms than any one person required, and that he would rather spend his money keeping her safe than on anything else he could think of. Weeks passed, then months. Simone's belly grew, and with it grew a strange, unfamiliar peace she had not expected to feel again so soon after everything had fallen apart. Do-yoon drove her to every appointment himself, refusing to send a driver in his place, sitting in waiting rooms full of magazines he never read because his eyes stayed fixed on the door she would walk through. At the 20-week scan, the doctor paused for a long moment, moving the instrument slowly across Simone's stomach, a small frown of concentration on her face. Simone gripped the edge of the table, certain something was wrong. The doctor turned the screen toward them and smiled instead of frowning. 3 heartbeats, she said. Not 1, not 2, but 3. Simone laughed and cried at the same time, a sound Do-yun would remember for the rest of his life, because it was the first time since the rain that he had heard her laugh without any sadness folded inside it. Triplets, the doctor confirmed. 2 boys and a girl, all strong, all healthy, all impossibly, wonderfully real. Do-yun gripped Simone's hand so tightly she had to remind him to loosen it. He did not say much in that moment, but later that night, sitting on the balcony of the penthouse, with the city spread out beneath them, he told her quietly that he had never imagined wanting to build a family with anyone, until the morning she had walked out of a house that did not deserve her. Not everyone approved. Simone's mother, when she learned the full story, sat quietly for a long time before asking only one question, whether Do-yun expected anything from Simone in return for his kindness. Simone had no answer ready, because she had wondered the same thing herself, late at night, staring at the ceiling of a room that was not yet fully hers. But the weeks kept passing, and Do-yun kept asking for nothing, and slowly the question stopped feeling urgent. Word traveled through Do-yun's business circle quickly, the way it always did among people who measured each other's worth in headlines. Some of his colleagues assumed Simone was simply his newest interest, a rumor he never bothered to correct, because correcting it would have meant explaining a truth far more complicated than gossip could hold. His mother, a sharp woman who ran half of the family's charitable foundations, arrived unannounced one afternoon, studied Simone across the kitchen table for a long, uncomfortable silence, and then said only that any woman her son chose to protect this fiercely must be worth protecting. She never questioned it again. The final months of the pregnancy were not easy. Simone's body ached in new ways every week, and there were nights she could not find comfort no matter how she turned. Do-yun learned to warm towels for her back, learned which foods settled her stomach and which did not, learned to sit beside her at 3 in the morning when sleep refused to come, saying nothing useful, only staying, which turned out to be the thing she needed most. The triplets arrived on a stormy night in early spring, born within 11 minutes of each other, each one announced by a nurse's voice, calling numbers that Simone would remember forever. The first boy came loud and furious, fists already swinging at the air. The second boy came quiet, watching the room with wide, careful eyes. The girl came last, and she came screaming loud enough to make the nurses laugh, a sound that seemed to say, even in her first minute of life, that she intended to be heard. Simone named them herself, choosing names that felt like armor, names that would carry weight in any room they entered. Sebastian for the eldest, Alexander for the second, and Aurelia for the girl who had announced herself so fiercely. Do-yun stood at the edge of the bed, holding all the weight he could manage in his own arms. Tears he did not bother to hide, slipping down a face that had not cried in front of another person in over a decade. The nurses called it one of the smoothest triplet deliveries the hospital had seen that year, though Simone would later laugh at the word smooth, remembering hours of pain that felt anything but. Do-yun had stayed beside her through every minute of it, his hand growing sore from how tightly she gripped it, refusing every offer from the staff to step outside and wait. He told her afterward that nothing in his life, not a single business deal or achievement, had ever made him feel as useless and as necessary at the same time as standing in that room had. He was not their father by blood, and he never once pretended otherwise. From the earliest days he made sure the children understood the truth plainly and gently, that their mother had loved another man once, that things had not worked between them, and that he, Do-yun, had simply been fortunate enough to be there when they needed someone. But knowing the truth never stopped Sebastian, Alexander, or Aurelia from calling him Dad, a word they chose for themselves the moment they were old enough to choose anything, and one he never corrected, though it always caught in his throat the first time he heard it from each of them. The years that followed were full and loud, in a way Do-yoon's quiet penthouse had never been before. Toys collected in corners no housekeeper could fully clear. Small handprints appeared on the glass doors leading to the balcony, no matter how many times they were wiped clean. Simone watched her children grow with a fierce, protective love, but she watched something else too, something that surprised her. The way Do-yoon's face changed whenever one of them ran toward him calling his name. Aurelia, from very early on, showed a temper that made both her brothers look calm by comparison. She spoke her mind before she had fully thought it through, and by the time she was 6, she had developed a habit that both worried and secretly amused the adults around her. Whenever the subject of her real father came up, usually because a classmate asked an innocent question, Aurelia would announce, with total seriousness, that the day she finally met him, she would gouge out his eyes. The first time she said it, Simone nearly dropped the plate she was carrying. Do-yoon, sitting at the table, had to press his napkin to his mouth to hide his laughter, though his eyes met Simone's over their daughter's head in a look that said neither of them quite knew what to do with a child so certain of her own fury. By the time the triplets turned 8, the threat had become something of a family joke, repeated at dinner tables and car rides, until it lost some of its sharp edges and became simply a piece of who Aurelia was. A girl who loved fiercely and hated just as openly, who never once pretended to feel something she did not feel. School brought its own difficulties. Other children asked why the triplets had a Korean father who did not look like them, and a mother who did not look like most of the other mothers picking up children after class. Sebastian handled the questions with a shrug, already learning his mother's trick of laughing before the joke could land. Alexander answered with careful, precise explanations that usually left the other children more confused than before. Aurelia, true to her nature, simply told anyone who asked that their family was none of their business, delivered with a look sharp enough that most children did not ask twice. Teachers at the small international school the triplets attended often remarked on how differently the 3 children carried themselves, though they were born within minutes of each other. Sebastian led every group project without seeming to notice he was leading it. Alexander preferred the back row, quietly correcting his classmates' mistakes only when asked. Aurelia refused, on principle, to sit anywhere but the front, insisting that she liked to see everything coming before it arrived. Simone often wondered which parts of them came from her, which from Malik, and which had simply grown out of the strange, patchwork family that had raised them. There were quieter moments too, ones that stayed with Simone longer than the loud ones. She remembered Do-yoon sitting on the floor of Alexander's room at midnight, both of them building a model ship neither could finish, arguing gently over instructions written in a language neither of them fully trusted. She remembered Sebastian falling asleep against Do-yoon's shoulder during a long car ride, and the careful way Do-yoon had driven the rest of the trip without moving his arm, though it must have gone numb an hour before they arrived. She remembered Aurelia, only 5 at the time, climbing into Do-yoon's lap during a thunderstorm and declaring that he was not allowed to be scared because she needed him to be brave for both of them. Do-yoon took the role of father seriously in every way that mattered. He learned to braid Aurelia's hair badly at first, and then with real skill, learned to sit through hours of Sebastian's questions about how engines worked, learned to let Alexander read quietly beside him for entire afternoons without needing to fill the silence with conversation. Simone watched him become something she had never expected to find twice in one lifetime, a man who chose to stay simply because staying was the right thing to do, long before love ever entered the conversation between the two of them. And love, quiet and unhurried, had entered the conversation, though neither of them had said the word aloud yet. They lived under one roof, shared meals, shared decisions about school and doctors and vacations, moved through each day like 2 people who had already built a marriage without ever standing in front of anyone to make it official. Simone told herself she was not ready to name what had grown between them. Do-yoon never pushed, he simply waited, the way he always had, patient in a manner that felt less like weakness and more like unshakable certainty. Late at night, after the children had finally settled and the penthouse grew quiet, Simone sometimes found herself watching Do-yun across the kitchen island as he read reports from work he rarely complained about, and she would feel something rise in her chest that frightened her more than any business failure or family cruelty ever had. Fear, she realized eventually, was simply what hope felt like to a woman who had been taught by hard experience not to trust it. She did not tell him this, but some nights she caught him watching her in the same unguarded way, and neither of them looked away as quickly as they once had. Her mother noticed it too, on visits home, remarking once that Simone laughed differently now, freer, less careful, the way a person laughs when they have finally stopped bracing for the ground to disappear beneath them. Simone brushed the comment aside at the time, unwilling to examine it too closely, though the words stayed with her longer than she admitted. The invitation arrived on an ordinary Tuesday, slipped through the mail slot along with bills and advertisements, easy to miss if Simone had not recognized the handwriting on the envelope immediately. Malik Reed was getting married, to RENÉE. Simone stood in the hallway for a long time, the envelope trembling slightly in her hand, though whether from anger or something closer to disbelief, she could not immediately say. 8 years had passed since the rain, since the smile she had given them instead of a scream, and somehow her ex-husband and her sister had found a way to invite her to witness their happiness, dressed up as courtesy, though everyone in the family understood exactly what it truly was. It was not an invitation, it was a performance, designed to remind Simone of everything she had supposedly lost, staged in front of an audience who would report back every detail of how she looked, how she carried herself, whether her eyes still held the wound from years ago. Malik wanted a show. He wanted to see her small again, standing alone at the edge of a room that no longer belonged to her. Simone thought about ignoring it completely, tossing the card into the bin and letting the wedding happen without her. Part of her wondered if that would be the stronger choice, refusing to give either of them her attention at all. But another part of her, quieter and more stubborn, wanted Malik to see exactly what his cruelty had built instead of destroyed. She wanted him to understand, in a single glance, that walking away from her had cost him something he would spend the rest of his life pretending not to miss. Simone carried the invitation to the kitchen, where Do-yun sat reading, and set it on the table without a word. He picked it up, read it once, and set it back down carefully, his expression unreadable in the way it always became when he was thinking through something serious. "Are you going?" he asked finally. Simone looked out the window for a long moment before she answered. "Yes," she said, "but not the way they are expecting." Do-yun studied her face, and something like the beginning of a smile pulled at the corner of his mouth, though his eyes stayed serious. "Then we will make sure of that," he said. That evening, the triplets were told about the wedding over dinner, and the reaction was immediate. Sebastian wanted to know why anyone would invite people to a wedding just to be cruel to them. Alexander asked quietly whether they would finally meet the man their mother had once been married to. Aurelia said nothing at first, only stared at her plate, before announcing that she had questions of her own for this man, questions she intended to ask in front of everyone if given the chance. Simone reached across the table and took her daughter's hand, telling her gently that revenge was not the reason they would attend, that they would go with their heads high and let their lives speak for themselves. Aurelia nodded, though the look in her eyes suggested she had already begun planning something the adults were not yet aware of. The weeks leading up to the wedding passed quickly. Do-yun arranged everything with quiet precision, a car, a stylist, a suit for himself that fit like it had been considered from every angle, and matching outfits for the children that made them look like they belonged in a magazine rather than a family drama unfolding after 8 long years. On the morning of the wedding, Simone stood in front of the mirror, barely recognizing the woman looking back at her. She wore deep emerald green, a color RENÉE had once told her, years ago, made her look common. Now it made her look powerful, the fabric catching the light every time she moved. Do-yun stood behind her in the mirror's reflection, adjusting his cufflinks, and told her simply that Malik was about to learn exactly what he had thrown away. Down the hall, the triplets were having their own quiet conversation, one that neither adult overheard. Sebastian had produced a small notebook where he had written down, in careful 8-year-old handwriting, a short list titled simply, "Things to Watch Today." Alexander read over his shoulder, nodding seriously at each item, while Aurelia sat cross-legged on the floor between them, arms folded, listening without offering much comment, which anyone who knew her well would have recognized as far more dangerous than if she had spoken up at all. When Simone knocked and asked if they were ready, all 3 children answered at once, a little too quickly, a little too brightly, and she should have paused right then to ask what exactly they were planning. But the car was already waiting downstairs, and there was no more time to notice the small, telling silence that followed her question down the hallway. The venue was a large hotel ballroom, decorated in white and gold, the kind of wedding meant to be photographed from every angle and shared widely afterward. Guests turned as Simone's car pulled up outside, whispers already beginning before she had even stepped out. When the door opened and she emerged, followed by Do-yoon and 3 children dressed sharper than most of the adults inside, the whispers turned into something closer to stunned silence. Malik, standing near the entrance greeting guests, froze mid-handshake when he saw her. RENÉE, checking her makeup in a small mirror nearby, looked up and went pale in a way no amount of powder could fix. Neither of them had expected this version of Simone, calm, radiant and utterly unbothered, walking toward them with a Korean billionaire on one arm and 3 children who watched the couple with sharp, unblinking eyes. Nearby relatives who had once whispered pity about Simone's empty arms now leaned toward each other with an entirely different kind of whisper, asking who the tall man beside her was and whether those beautiful children truly belonged to her. Malik's own mother, who had stopped calling Simone years earlier, stared from across the room with an expression that flickered between confusion and something that looked almost like regret, though she quickly rearranged her face into practiced politeness when Simone's eyes passed briefly over her. A cousin of Malik, never known for holding her tongue, hurried over under the guise of greeting Simone warmly, though her real purpose was clearly to gather details for the rest of the family. She complimented the children loudly, asked pointed questions about Do-yoon's company, and left the conversation looking faintly disappointed that Simone had given her nothing to carry back except pleasant, unremarkable answers. Sebastian looked up at his mother and asked, in a voice just loud enough for nearby guests to hear, whether this was the man who had made her cry so many years ago. Malik's smile faltered completely. Aurelia said nothing yet, but her gaze never left her father's face, steady and unreadable, the kind of look that made grown men shift uncomfortably in their seats. A wedding planner, flustered and unsure of protocol, hurried forward to guide Simone and her family toward their assigned table, tucked near the back where Malik had clearly intended to keep her out of sight. Do-yoon did not move toward it. He simply gave the planner a quiet, pleasant smile and asked whether the family of the bride's own sister truly belonged so far from the center of things. Within minutes, without anyone quite understanding how it had happened, new seats were arranged near the front, close enough that Malik would not be able to avoid looking at them for the rest of the evening. RENÉE approached briefly before the ceremony began, her smile brittle, her eyes darting between Simone and the children with something that looked almost like fear. She said she was glad Simone had come, that it meant a great deal to her, words that sounded rehearsed and hollow the moment they left her mouth. Simone thanked her politely and said nothing more, and RENÉE retreated quickly, unsettled by a calm she had clearly expected to find broken. The ceremony itself passed the way ceremonies do, vows exchanged, rings placed, applause offered on cue. Simone watched Malik's face as he said his promises to RENÉE, searching for some flicker of the man she had once loved, and found instead a stranger performing lines he had likely rehearsed more than once before. Sebastian leaned over at one point and whispered that the whole thing looked boring, and Simone had to press her lips together to keep from laughing out loud in the middle of another woman's wedding. Do-yoon sat perfectly still through the entire ceremony, his expression polite and unreadable to anyone watching from a distance, though Simone could feel the tension in his arm where it rested against hers. When Malik slid the ring onto RENÉE's finger, Do-yoon's hand found Simone's beneath the folds of her dress, and held it. Not tightly, just steady. A small anchor she had not realized she needed until it was there. She glanced at him once, and he was already looking back at her, and for a moment, the noise of the ceremony faded into something distant and unimportant. Behind them, an elderly aunt leaned toward her neighbor and murmured, loud enough for several rows to hear, that she had never seen the bride's own sister look quite so at peace, attending a wedding that, by all rights, should have broken her heart twice over. The comment rippled quietly through nearby seats, and more than one guest turned to study Simone's composed face, searching for cracks that simply were not there. Dinner began not long after, servers moving between tables with trays balanced expertly overhead, quiet conversation rising and falling around the room. Aurelia had grown unusually silent throughout the meal, pushing food around her plate, her eyes fixed on the head table where Malik sat laughing loudly at something a groomsman had said. Simone noticed the silence and reached over to squeeze her daughter's hand under the table, a small reminder of the promise they had made before arriving. Aurelia squeezed back, but her eyes never left her father's face, and something in her expression made Do-Yun set down his glass and lean close to Simone, murmuring low enough that only she could hear him. He had seen that look on Aurelia before, usually right before something happened that no one else in the room saw coming. Across the table, Sebastian and Alexander exchanged a glance of their own, a silent conversation passing between them the way it sometimes did between siblings who had shared a womb and, it seemed, more than a few secrets since. Neither boy said anything aloud, but something had clearly already been decided between them, and whatever it was, it would not stay hidden much longer. The band finished a slow song, and the microphone was carried toward the head table, where the best man tapped a spoon against his glass to call the room to attention. Guests turned in their chairs, glasses lifted halfway, ready for the kind of gentle, forgettable toast that weddings usually produced. No one at that moment expected anything different. Malik stood, buttoning his jacket, clearing his throat, glancing briefly at RENÉE with the practiced confidence of a man who believed the hardest part of the evening was already behind him. He had no idea that his daughter, only 8 years old, sitting quietly at a table he had tried to hide her at, was already rising from her seat with a question in her mouth that would not stay silent a moment longer. Malik tapped the microphone once, clearing his throat, glancing toward RENÉE with the easy confidence of a man who believed the hardest part of the evening was behind him. He had no idea that barely 20 minutes earlier, during the short break between courses, his daughter had watched her aunt hurry toward the powder room with her eyes already streaming, and that the sight had done nothing to soften what Aurelia was about to do. The break between courses had felt, to most guests, like nothing more than an ordinary pause, servers clearing plates, a few couples drifting toward the terrace for fresh air, the band shifting quietly between songs. No one but the Triplets understood that the pause held its own small drama, one that had been building since the moment they arrived that morning with a notebook full of careful, whispered plans. The truth was, chaos had already been moving quietly through the reception long before anyone noticed it. RENÉE's makeup artist had touched up her face twice already, confused each time by the sudden redness blooming across her client's cheeks and nose. A little pepper, pressed carefully into the loose powder of a compact left unattended on a dressing table, was a small thing, easy to miss, impossible to undo once it had been applied. At 2 of the guest tables, murmurs had risen over plates that tasted strangely wrong, desserts that pulled sour faces instead of smiles, coffee poured with salt instead of sugar resting beside the cream. The waitstaff apologized without understanding what had gone wrong in their own kitchen, and no one thought to look toward the 3 unusually well-behaved children seated near the front, sipping their juice with perfectly innocent expressions. Do-Yun had noticed everything. He always did. Midway through dessert, he leaned toward Sebastian and asked, in a voice too quiet for anyone else to catch, whether a certain small jar had gone missing from the kitchen earlier that afternoon. Sebastian's ears turned red. Alexander suddenly found his napkin fascinating. Aurelia alone held her father's gaze, unashamed, her chin lifted the way it always was when she had decided something was worth the trouble that followed. He excused the three of them from the table under the pretense of finding the restroom, walked them to a quiet hallway near the coat check, and crouched down to their eye level, his voice low and serious, in a way the children rarely heard from him. He told them plainly that he understood why they were angry, that their anger made sense, that no one who loved their mother could watch her hurt and feel nothing. But he told them just as plainly that revenge dressed up as pranks did not heal anything. It only gave people like Malik a reason to say the children had been raised without discipline, without grace, and that such a story would only hurt Simone more than it hurt him. Sebastian apologized first, quietly, the way he always did when he realized he had gone too far. Alexander nodded along, relieved the secret was finally out in the open. Aurelia was the last to speak, and when she did, her voice cracked in a way that surprised even her brothers. She said she was not sorry about the pepper or the salt. Not really, but she was sorry if it made things harder for their mother. Do-yoon studied her for a long moment, then pulled all three of them into a hug that none of them expected, telling them that being angry was not the problem. It never had been. The problem was only what a person chose to do with that anger once it arrived. They returned to the table just as the room quieted for the toasts, and Simone, glancing at their faces, knew immediately that something had happened, though she could not yet guess what. She reached for Aurelia's hand under the table the way she always did, a small ritual meant to steady them both, and felt her daughter's fingers tremble slightly before curling tightly around her own. Malik began his toast the way most grooms do, thanking guests warmly for coming out on such short notice, thanking his parents, thanking RENÉE for standing beside him through what he called a difficult season of his life. He never once mentioned, not even briefly, what that difficult season had actually contained. He spoke instead of new beginnings, of second chances freely given, of love finding its way through unexpected doors, words that landed hollow in the ears of anyone who truly knew the shape of the story he was telling. It was in the small pause after that line, while guests lifted their glasses in polite anticipation of the toast's ending, that Aurelia rose from her chair. She was small against the size of the room, her dress slightly wrinkled from a long day of sitting quietly. Her chin lifted the way it always was, and for a moment no one quite understood what was happening. A child standing uninvited near the head table, while a wedding toast hung unfinished in the air. Simone reached for her, too late, her fingers closing on empty space where her daughter's hand had been a second before. Aurelia's voice, when it finally came, was clear enough to carry to every distant corner of the ballroom, steady, in a way that made several guests lower their glasses without realizing they had done it. She asked her father a single question, whether he had ever told RENÉE the whole story of how he and her mother had come to be together, whether RENÉE understood that the very bed she would now share with him had once belonged to someone else, someone who had trusted him completely until the morning she found him with the woman he was now promising the rest of his life to. The room went silent, as if everyone in it had stopped breathing at once. Somewhere near the back, a phone that had already been recording captured every word without a single interruption, the small red light blinking steadily as the girl's voice began to break. She was not finished. Aurelia said that she used to tell everyone she would gouge out her father's eyes the day she finally met him, and that everyone always laughed when she said it, because it sounded like something a child says without meaning it. She said she had meant every word of it once, but standing there, looking at him for the first time in her life, she found she did not want to hurt him at all. She only wanted to know if he had ever once, in 8 years, wondered what happened to the wife he threw out into the rain. Malik stood frozen at the head table, the microphone still loosely in his hand, his face draining of color under the soft gold, lighting the wedding planner had chosen so carefully for photographs. RENÉE's eyes filled instantly, her hand pressed hard against her mouth, though whether from shame or shock, no one in the room could say for certain. Aurelia turned then, not toward her father anymore, but toward RENÉE, and asked her the question that would follow the woman for years afterward, whether she truly believed a man capable of breaking two sisters apart would never do the same thing to her, given enough time and enough temptation. No one moved. Waiters stood frozen mid-step, with trays balanced on their shoulders. The band, who had been quietly tuning for the next song, let their instruments fall silent, without anyone signaling them to stop. Somewhere in the crowd, an older woman began to cry softly, though she had no personal stake in any of it, moved simply by the sight of a child, brave enough to say what half the room had likely thought at some point that evening. A few guests near the front exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to look at the bride, the groom, or the small, trembling girl standing between them, while others simply lowered their eyes to their plates, uncomfortable witnesses to a truth none of them had been prepared to hear, delivered so plainly. Somewhere near the bar, a young cousin of Malik's whispered to her date that she had always suspected something was wrong with the story everyone told about the wedding, though she had never once imagined it would surface quite like this, in front of everyone, from the mouth of a child barely tall enough to see over the head table. Simone rose from her seat at last, moving quickly but without panic, and crossed the small distance to where her daughter stood trembling, despite the steadiness of her voice. She wrapped an arm around Aurelia's shoulders and guided her gently away from the head table, whispering something only the two of them would ever know, words that made Aurelia finally release the tears she had been holding since the moment she first smelled pepper on her aunt's face and decided enough was enough. Do-yoon followed close behind, one hand resting lightly on Sebastian's shoulder and the other on Alexander's, guiding the boys away from the wreckage of a toast that would never be finished. He did not look back at Malik, not even once, though every guest in that room searched his face for some sign of triumph and found instead only quiet concern for the children walking beside him. By the time they reached the hotel lobby, reporters who covered the local society pages, tipped off by guests already texting friends outside, were gathering near the entrance with cameras raised. Do-yoon's security, arranged quietly weeks in advance because he never attended an event without preparing for every possibility, moved swiftly to clear a path, shielding the children from the flashing lights until they were safely inside the car. The footage reached the internet before midnight. By morning it had traveled far beyond the small circle of guests who had witnessed it firsthand, shared and reshared with captions that grew more dramatic with each repost, though none of them needed much embellishment, the raw footage alone carrying more weight than any caption could add. Simone did not sleep that night either, though this time the reason was entirely different from the sleepless night 8 years earlier. She sat on the edge of Aurelia's bed, long after her daughter had finally drifted off, watching the small chest rise and fall, thinking of all the years she had tried to shield her children from a story that had, in the end, found its way out, regardless of anything she did to contain it. Do-yoon found her there near midnight, and instead of speaking right away, he simply sat beside her on the floor, his back against the bed frame, close enough that their shoulders touched. He told her quietly that he was not sorry the truth had come out, though he understood if she wished it had happened differently, in a room without cameras, without an audience hungry for something to talk about over breakfast. Simone rested her head against his shoulder, exhausted in a way that went deeper than the hour. She told him she had spent 8 years protecting her children from bitterness, only to watch her own daughter carry more of it than she ever realized. Do-yoon reminded her gently that Aurelia had not spoken out of bitterness alone, she had spoken out of love, fierce and unguarded, the same love that made her climb into his lap during thunderstorms and demand he be brave for both of them. The following days brought a storm of a different kind. Malik's family called repeatedly, some in anger, some in a strange, belated attempt at sympathy that arrived far too late to mean much. RENÉE sent messages that Simone left unread for 3 full days, unsure whether she had the strength yet to face whatever her sister might say. A few distant relatives, people Simone had not spoken to in years, resurfaced suddenly with messages of support that felt more curious than genuine, eager for details rather than truly concerned for how she and the children were coping. Reporters who specialized in gossip rather than real news tried repeatedly to reach Simone directly, offers of money exchanged for an exclusive interview arriving through every channel they could find. Do-yoon handled most of it himself, quietly instructing his legal team to issue a single, brief statement asking for privacy for the children involved, refusing every request for comment beyond that. He never once tried to control what Simone chose to say or not say, only made certain she had the space to decide for herself, without the noise of the outside world pressing in before she was ready. Do-yoon's own mother called within the first day, her voice tight with concern, not for the family's reputation, but for the children's well-being, asking pointed questions about how Aurelia was sleeping, whether Sebastian and Alexander had anyone to talk to, who was not simply another adult trying to manage the crisis around them, careful and thorough, the way only a grandmother already devoted to children, not yet officially her own, could be. She arrived in person by the end of the week, bringing with her a quiet, steadying presence that Simone had come to rely on more than she expected, sitting with the triplets for hours, listening without judgment, reminding them gently that courage sometimes looked messy from the outside, but was never something to be ashamed of. The school reached out as well, cautious and careful, offering counseling sessions the triplets mostly refused, though Alexander eventually agreed to a handful of quiet conversations with the school psychologist, conversations Simone never pushed him to describe in detail, grateful only that he had somewhere safe and private to place the weight he carried more silently than either of his siblings ever seemed to. The triplets, for their part, adjusted differently to their sudden and unwanted fame. Sebastian found the attention mildly amusing, joking that he had never expected to become internet famous over a wedding speech he had not even given. He kept a small, private tally for a while of how many strangers recognized him at the park, treating it almost like a game, until even he grew tired of the attention and quietly stopped counting. Alexander grew quieter than usual, uncomfortable with strangers recognizing his face at the grocery store, at the park, in places that used to feel ordinary and now felt exposed. Aurelia refused to discuss it at all, deflecting every question from teachers and classmates with the same sharp precision she used for everything else, though at night, when she thought no one could hear her, Simone sometimes caught the sound of quiet crying through the thin wall between their rooms. Weeks passed before the noise around the video finally began to fade, replaced eventually by newer stories that captured the internet's short attention elsewhere. Life in the penthouse slowly returned to something resembling normal. Mornings spent rushing through breakfast before school, evenings spent around a table that had grown steadily more crowded and more loved with each passing year. Renée's messages, when Simone finally read them, were not the excuses she had braced herself for. They were simple, almost painfully so, 3 words repeated across several attempts, each one slightly more desperate than the last, asking only for a chance to speak, no defense offered, no explanation demanded in return. Simone did not respond right away. She needed time to decide whether forgiveness was even something she wanted to offer, or whether some wounds were meant to stay open, a reminder rather than a scar that eventually faded. Do-yoon never pushed her one way or the other, telling her only that whatever she decided, he would stand behind it completely, though privately he hoped, for her sake more than Renée's, that carrying the weight of that anger forever would only tire her out in the end. Nearly a year passed before the next chapter of the story arrived, quiet at first, the way most turning points are before they reveal their full shape. Malik and Renée's marriage, which had begun under such careful staging, had not settled into the peace either of them likely imagined for themselves. Renée, now raising a newborn son of her own, found herself exhausted in ways no one had properly warned her about. Her body changed by pregnancy in ways she had once judged harshly and unfairly in other women, without ever understanding, until it happened to her, the true cost of carrying and delivering a child. In quieter moments, alone with her son at 3 in the morning, Renée had begun to notice things about Malik she had once been too dazzled to see clearly. The way his attention drifted whenever a conversation no longer centered on him, the small, careless comments about her changed body that he seemed to believe were harmless simply because he delivered them with a smile. She thought often, though she told no one, of the wedding video that had spread across the internet, of her niece's steady, devastating voice asking whether she truly believed he would never do it again. She had told herself for months that Aurelia was only a child, speaking out of old hurt. Slowly, uncomfortably, she began to wonder if the child had simply seen what the adults around her refused to. It was at a dinner Malik hosted for colleagues, meant to celebrate a promotion he had recently received, that the final piece of the story arrived. A Korean model, someone Malik had been quietly seeing for months without Renée's knowledge, arrived as a guest of a colleague, seated only a few chairs away from the wife she did not yet know she was betraying so openly. Over the course of the evening, fueled by wine and a carelessness she would later regret, the woman made a comment about Renée's body in front of several guests, remarking that she had let herself go since the baby, that Malik deserved better company than someone who no longer took care of herself. She excused herself from the table before anyone could see her cry, locking herself in a bathroom stall while the sound of laughter continued through the door. It was there, sitting on the closed lid of a toilet in a designer dress that no longer fit quite right, that she finally understood, in full and unbearable clarity, exactly what she had done to her own sister 8 years earlier, and exactly what it felt like to sit on the other side of that particular cruelty. She left the dinner without saying goodbye to Malik, driving straight to the only place she could think to go, though she had not visited in years and had no real reason to believe she would be welcomed. Simone opened the door that evening to find her sister standing in the hallway, mascara streaked down both cheeks, her hands shaking too hard to hold her own phone steady. Malik, for his part, never learned the full extent of what that dinner cost him. He noticed only that Renée grew quieter in the months that followed, less willing to laugh at his jokes, more careful with her words, though he assumed, in the same careless way he assumed most things about the people around him, that the change had something to do with the baby and nothing at all to do with him. He continued seeing the model for a while longer, growing sloppier about hiding it, until Renée finally found the messages herself and understood, with a clarity that arrived far too late to spare her the pain of it, exactly what kind of man she had chosen over her own sister. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Then Renée said the words she had been trying to say for nearly a year, that she was sorry, not the small, easy kind of sorry offered to smooth over an awkward silence, but the deep, aching kind that came from finally understanding the true size of what she had broken. Simone stood in the doorway for a long time, torn between the urge to close the door and the older, more stubborn pull of a bond built over an entire childhood, a bond that had cracked, but perhaps had not entirely shattered. In the end, she stepped aside and let her sister in, not because the wound was healed, but because she recognized, painfully, the same kind of hollow devastation she herself had carried out of that bedroom 8 years before. They sat together at the kitchen table long into the night, the same table where the triplets ate breakfast every morning, and for the first time since the affair, Renée told her sister everything. How the affair had started slowly, almost accidentally, a shared laugh that turned into something neither of them had the courage to stop in time. How guilt had eaten at her every single day since, quietly, in ways she never let anyone see. How she had watched Simone build an entire life without her, and felt both proud and unbearably ashamed at the same time. Simone listened without interrupting, and when Renée finally finished, she told her own truth in return, how the smile she had given them in that bedroom doorway had cost her more than any scream ever could have, how she had carried the wound in silence for years, because showing it felt like handing Malik one more victory. The two sisters cried together then, the kind of crying that comes only after years of holding something back, messy and loud, and entirely without shame. Outside, the city had gone quiet with the late hour, and somewhere down the hall one of the triplets stirred briefly in their sleep, unaware that their aunt sat crying at the kitchen table for the first time in years without pretending everything was fine. Simone made tea neither of them drank, the cups going cold between them as the conversation wound on, circling back again and again to memories neither sister had spoken aloud in nearly a decade, childhood summers, a shared bicycle, the particular sound of their mother calling them both in for dinner. It was not a clean reconciliation. Simone made that clear before Renée left that night, telling her plainly that trust, once broken so completely, does not simply return because an apology finally arrives. But she also told her sister that she was willing to try, slowly, carefully, to rebuild something smaller and more honest than what they once had. A relationship built without illusions this time, both of them finally seeing each other clearly. Meanwhile, inside the walls of the penthouse, a different kind of plotting had quietly begun. The triplets, now 9 years old and sharper than ever, had shifted their attention entirely away from revenge and toward a new mission, one they discussed in careful, hushed conferences held mostly in Alexander's room after their mother believed them asleep. The plan, as Sebastian explained it one evening, while the three of them sat cross-legged on the floor, was simple. Their mother and Do-yoon already lived like a married couple in every way that mattered, sharing meals, sharing decisions, sharing a life the triplets had never known any differently. All that remained, in Sebastian's careful 8-year-old logic, now 9, was to make it official, and if the adults were too slow to notice what was obvious to everyone else in the household, then perhaps they simply needed a little help noticing. Their first attempt was clumsy. Alexander suggested they simply ask Do-yoon directly whether he liked their mother, a question he posed one evening at dinner, with no warning at all. Do-yoon, mid-bite, nearly choked on his food, recovering just enough to answer honestly that of course he liked her. She was one of his closest friends. Aurelia, unsatisfied with such a careful answer, pressed further, asking whether liking someone as a friend was truly the same thing as the way he looked at her every single morning over coffee. Do-yoon set down his fork slowly, glanced at Simone across the table, and said nothing at all, which the children agreed afterward was answer enough. Encouraged, they escalated their efforts. Sebastian suggested that if Do-yoon already loved their mother, the obvious next step was simply asking him to marry her, and so, without consulting either adult first, he asked the question outright one Saturday afternoon while the 5 of them sat together in the car. Do-yoon's hands tightened briefly on the steering wheel before he answered carefully that such decisions were not made quickly, that marriage required both people to be ready, and that he would never rush Simone towards something she had not chosen fully on her own. Alexander, listening closely from the back seat, pointed out with irritating logic that they already lived together, already shared every meal, already made every important decision as a family, so what exactly was left to wait for? Do-yoon laughed despite himself, though the sound carried something more thoughtful underneath it, and told the children gently that some things, even obvious things, deserved to happen at the right pace rather than the fastest one. Not to be outdone by her brothers, Aurelia took her own approach in the weeks that followed, quietly leaving bridal magazines open to particular pages on the kitchen counter, where Do-yoon would find them before his morning coffee. Each one folded to a page, showing rings she had apparently decided, with great confidence, suited her mother's taste exactly. Do-yoon said nothing about the magazines directly, though Simone noticed he had started lingering a little longer near jewelry store windows on their walks through the city, pretending, not very convincingly, that he was simply admiring the architecture of the buildings behind the glass. Simone, sitting quietly in the passenger seat through the entire exchange, said nothing, though her cheeks had warmed considerably by the time they reached home, and later that night, lying awake long after the house had gone quiet, she found herself thinking about the question far longer than she was willing to admit out loud to anyone, even herself. Undeterred by careful adult answers, the triplets moved to more elaborate schemes. They arranged, through a combination of forged notes and carefully timed disappearances, for Simone and Do-yoon to end up alone together at increasingly inconvenient moments. A candle-lit dinner they claimed was a school project, requiring parental supervision. A rooftop garden visit they insisted needed adult company for safety reasons that made little logical sense under close questioning. The candlelit dinner nearly ended in disaster when Do-yoon, suspicious of the sudden absence of all 3 children the moment the food arrived, texted Sebastian directly asking where they had gone, only to receive a photo of the 3 of them hiding rather unsuccessfully behind a large potted plant 2 tables away, watching the entire scene unfold with badly concealed excitement. Simone laughed so hard at the photo that she nearly knocked over her water glass, and Do-yoon, shaking his head, admitted that their children had clearly inherited someone's stubbornness, though he refused to say whose. The rooftop garden attempt fared little better. The children had arranged, through means neither adult ever fully uncovered, for the elevator to stop working conveniently between floors just long enough to strand Simone and Do-yoon together near the small garden the building maintained for residents. What the triplets had not accounted for was the elevator repair technician arriving within minutes, thoroughly confused by 3 children hovering nearby, insisting everything was fine and there was absolutely no need to fix anything just yet. Do-yoon eventually pulled all 3 of them aside after that particular attempt, trying and failing to keep a straight face, as he explained that tampering with building equipment was, in fact, a genuinely serious matter, not a matchmaking tool, and that he needed them to promise no further elevators would be sabotaged in pursuit of their romantic ambitions for their mother. The triplets promised, solemnly, though Simone caught all 3 of them exchanging a look afterward that suggested the promise applied strictly to elevators and left plenty of other options still on the table. The building's head of maintenance, a patient man who had worked there longer than Do-yoon had owned the penthouse, later admitted privately to the housekeeper that he suspected the outage had not been a mechanical fault at all, though he wisely chose never to raise the matter directly with the family upstairs, having grown rather fond of the 3 children who greeted him by name every time he passed through the lobby. It was Aurelia, in the end, who orchestrated the moment that finally worked, though not through any elaborate scheme at all. One evening, tired of watching 2 grown adults circle each other with such maddening patience, she simply walked into the living room where Do-yoon sat reading and Simone sat nearby with a book she had not turned a page of in 20 minutes, and asked, in front of both of them, whether they loved each other, plainly, without any softening around the question, the way adults usually managed. The silence that followed stretched long enough that Sebastian and Alexander, drawn by the sudden quiet, appeared in the doorway to see what had happened. Do-yoon set his book down slowly, looked at Simone for a long moment, and then, instead of answering his daughter, he stood, crossed the room, and knelt in front of Simone's chair, taking her hand in both of his, the way he had done so many times before, though never quite like this. He told her, in front of the 3 children who had spent months engineering exactly this moment, that he had loved her since a rainy night 8 years earlier, when she called him crying, and he cancelled a meeting 3 months in the making, without a single moment of hesitation. He told her he had watched her build a family out of heartbreak, raise 3 extraordinary children with a strength he still did not fully understand, and that he did not want to spend one more year of his life pretending the word friend was enough to hold what actually lived between them. He asked her, simply and without any grand production, whether she would finally let him make it official, not because their children had pushed them toward it, though he was grateful for their stubbornness, but because he could no longer imagine a single version of his future that did not include her standing beside him in it. Simone, tears already falling before he finished speaking, told him yes, her voice breaking on the single word in a way that made all 3 children erupt into cheering, loud enough to bring the housekeeper rushing in from the kitchen to see what had happened. Aurelia, not one to let a moment pass without her own commentary, announced loudly that she had known this would work eventually, though her brothers were quick to remind her that the actual breakthrough had happened entirely by accident. Do-yoon's mother, called immediately with the news, arrived at the penthouse within the hour, still wearing her house slippers, pulling Simone into an embrace so fierce it lifted her slightly off the floor, whispering that she had waited 5 years to welcome her properly as family, and had begun to worry, privately, that her son's patience might outlast even her own. She brought with her, tucked inside her coat pocket, a small velvet box that had belonged to her own mother decades earlier, explaining through happy tears that she had been carrying it hopefully in her bag for months, waiting for exactly this kind of phone call. She turned next to the triplets, kneeling despite her age to look each of them in the eye, telling them solemnly that whatever they had done to finally push their parents toward this moment, she considered it the finest work any grandchildren of hers had ever accomplished. The wedding, when it finally came several months later, was nothing like the performance Malik and RENÉE had staged years before. It was smaller, warmer, held in a garden Do-yoon's mother had helped select, filled with people who had actually earned their place in Simone's life, rather than guests invited simply to witness a show. There were no reporters this time, no phones raised in secret, only the quiet click of a single photographer Do-yoon had personally chosen and briefed on exactly how little intrusion the family wished to allow. Simone's own mother stood proudly near the front, tears streaming freely, finally seeing her daughter marry a man who had never once made her question her own worth. Lanterns hung low between the trees, catching the early evening light in a way that made the whole garden feel as though it had been dipped in gold. Do-yoon's business partners, so often stiff and formal in boardrooms, arrived in casual linen suits and seemed, to Simone's quiet amusement, almost unrecognizable without their usual severity. His mother had insisted on overseeing the flowers herself, refusing anything too elaborate, choosing instead simple white blooms that reminded her, she said, of the quiet strength she had recognized in Simone from the very first afternoon they met across a kitchen table years before. Simone's mother had flown in from Seoul a full week early, unable to contain her excitement, spending the days before the wedding fussing over every small detail alongside the wedding planner, occasionally breaking into tears at unexpected moments, once simply while folding napkins, overwhelmed by the sheer distance her daughter had traveled from the frightened young bride she remembered marrying Malik so many years before. RENÉE attended, seated quietly among family rather than at the head of anything, her relationship with Simone still careful and still healing, but genuinely present in a way it had not been in years. She brought her son, now old enough to toddle unsteadily between the chairs, and watched with quiet gratitude as her sister walked toward a future built on something far sturdier than the one she herself had once carelessly destroyed. The triplets stood at the front of the ceremony, dressed in matching outfits they had actually helped choose this time, beaming with the particular pride of children who understood, correctly, that they had played no small part in bringing the day about. Sebastian served as the ring-bearer, taking the job with far more seriousness than anyone expected. Alexander read a short passage he had chosen and practiced for weeks, his voice only shaking slightly at the most important lines. Aurelia stood closest to her mother, holding the small bouquet with the same fierce concentration she brought to everything else in her life. When the officiant finally asked whether anyone objected to the marriage, a question included mostly out of tradition rather than genuine expectation, Aurelia raised her hand immediately, drawing startled laughter across the entire garden. She said, when the officiant nervously allowed her to speak, that her only objection was that it had taken the two adults far too long to figure out what she and her brothers had known for years. The garden erupted into warm laughter, and Do-yoon, still holding Simone's hands, leaned down and kissed his new daughter's forehead before turning back to finish what the officiant had actually been asking him to say. Simone stood at the center of it all, surrounded by a family she had never planned for and could not now imagine living without, thinking briefly of the woman she had been 8 years earlier, standing under a rain-soaked awning with nowhere left to go. That woman could not have imagined this garden, this man, these 3 fierce and loyal children who had fought harder for her happiness than she had ever fought for it herself. The rain that once fell on her that terrible night felt, in this moment, like something from an entirely different life, one she no longer needed to carry with her. After the ceremony, as the small crowd moved toward the reception tables scattered beneath strings of soft lights, Do-yoon pulled Simone aside for a quiet moment, away from the noise, just the two of them standing at the edge of the garden where the music grew faint and the stars had begun to show clearly overhead. He told her that he had waited 5 years to see this exact moment, and that every single one of those years, even the hardest ones, had been worth it simply because they had led here, to this garden, to this life they had built so carefully together, out of the wreckage someone else had left behind. Simone rested her head against his shoulder, watching her children chase each other across the grass with the kind of joy that only comes from knowing, completely and without doubt, that they were loved. She thought of her sister sitting quietly among the guests, choosing forgiveness slowly and honestly rather than demanding it be given freely. She thought of Malik, somewhere far away in a life that no longer touched hers, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that she felt nothing toward him anymore. Not anger, not grief, only the distant indifference reserved for a chapter long since finished. The band began a slow song, and Do-yoon drew her gently onto the small dance floor set up beneath the lights, the two of them moving unhurried, patient, exactly the way their entire story had unfolded from the very beginning. Around them, the triplets eventually stopped their chasing and drifted closer, drawn in by the music, until all five of them ended up dancing together in one uneven, laughing circle that no photographer could have staged half as beautifully as it happened on its own. Simone looked around at the garden, at the faces of people who had chosen to stay through every difficult season, at the children who had turned a mother's quiet grief into fierce, unbreakable love, and understood finally that the humiliation someone had once tried to hand her had transformed, slowly and completely, into something no one could have predicted on that rainy night so many years before. She had not simply survived what Malik and RENÉE had done to her. She had built, out of every broken piece, a life so full and so loved that the wound which once felt permanent had become, at last, only the beginning of a much longer and much brighter story. 3 years later, on an ordinary Sunday morning that held no particular significance beyond the simple comfort of routine, Simone stood in the kitchen of the penthouse, watching Do-yoon attempt, badly, to teach her now 12-year-old Aurelia how to properly whisk pancake batter without spilling half of it across the counter. Sebastian sat nearby, scrolling through a book on marine engineering he had become suddenly obsessed with, while Alexander read quietly at the table, occasionally glancing up to correct his sister's technique with the same patient precision he brought to everything. RENÉE visited most Sundays now, her son old enough to run laughing through the penthouse, with the triplets chasing after him, and though the relationship between the two sisters would never again be the effortless, unguarded thing it once was, it had settled into something honest, something built carefully rather than assumed, which Simone had come to understand was its own kind of strength. Malik remained a distant figure in their lives, a name occasionally mentioned but rarely dwelled upon. His absence from their happiness no longer felt as a wound, but simply as a fact, unremarkable, the way weather from a season-long past no longer touches the present. Aurelia, older now and slightly less inclined to threaten violence against anyone, had grown into precisely the kind of fierce, outspoken young woman everyone who knew her as a child had predicted she would become. She still spoke her mind before fully thinking it through, still refused to sit anywhere but where she could see the whole room, but the anger that once defined her had softened, without disappearing entirely, into something closer to conviction, a refusal to let injustice pass by unremarked whenever she encountered it. Do-yoon, flour now dusted across one cheek, courtesy of his daughter's enthusiasm with the whisk, caught Simone watching them from across the kitchen, and smiled the same unhurried smile he had given her the very first night she arrived, soaked and broken at his door. She smiled back, thinking, not for the first time, that the life she had once believed was finished on a rainy evening years ago had instead simply been waiting, patiently, for its real beginning to arrive. Outside, the city moved on the way cities always do, indifferent to the private histories unfolding behind any one set of windows. Somewhere across that same city, in an apartment far removed from gardens and pancake batter and children arguing over whose turn it was to lick the bowl, Malik lived a life Simone no longer wondered about, and that indifference itself felt like the final, quiet proof of how far she had traveled from the woman who once stood frozen in a bedroom doorway. But inside that kitchen, filled with the smell of pancakes and the sound of 3 children arguing cheerfully, Simone understood completely that every hard year, every quiet humiliation, every tear shed under a rain-soaked awning had led her here, to a family built not from obligation or convenience but from choice, renewed every single ordinary morning, and that this, more than any grand gesture or dramatic reversal, was the truest victory of all.